The Hannah Arendt reference is obvious in this paper, right? Indeed, this paper is partly framed by her question, how can that which is legal result in evil? Because the other conceptual framework for this paper is Spinoza's question, why do people fight for their servitude as if it was their salvation? This paper pulls together these two ideas to explore something which have bothered many city planners by Arts himself. If planners do not mean harm, how come there's so many protests against their plans and policies to make the city civil? How is the civil understood and applied by planners, especially regarding housing affordability and placemaking? Which public is the civilness for? What planning tools are used to prove and or to implement this civilness? Why do planners have faith in the law and the civil? We will address the above questions in 3 sections. First, we'll explore how the civil was understood and managed by quantifying that which is unquantifiable. James C. Scott calls this a stagecraft process of effacing difference in order to make the natural and social realms more legible to planning trajectories. Second, we ask, what are the forces at play when a planner conducts something like shadow studies to justify more shadows in exchange for more housing? In particular, we look at how what Baruch Spinoza calls passive forces can limit our capacity to act and think beyond the borders of something like a shadow study or the housing crisis narrative. With this limitation, a planner's faith in this narrative might even lead to their own loss of home via redevelopment. Yet the planner continues to do shadow studies as if it will save them from unaffordability. And in the last section, we take up again Arendt's idea that following the law dutifully can still produce evil. And we use this idea as a platform to further explore how planners can produce harm even if none is intended. We end with a suggestion that the lawful can steer towards developing new modes of living with others instead of just acting in accordance to the law. Now, I would say planners rarely intend harm. There's certain kind of altruism about them. The professional oath actually compels them to do civic good. But what is this civic good? The civic good may be conceived as a way forward resulting from an unbiased deliberation after considering and balancing competing interests. It is a balancing act. In fact, the British Columbia Planning Institute's Code of Ethics actually states that a planner must balance the interests of communities and the interests of individuals. The planner demonstrates their competence when they retain a sense of independence that will enable them to exercise their professional judgment independently and without bias. The wording here suggests the ethical and civicness is the balance of competing interests. But I would ask, what is being balanced? So to balance competing interests, trade-offs is something we often use. Planners must decide what to let go for the betterment of the general civil society. So for example, large mature trees which may constrain a building's footprint might be removed to expedite the building of housing. The trade-off is justified by using the comparison. For example, losing X number of housing units is seen as a greater loss than losing those trees. A constrained footprint may also mean that less floor area is buildable, or a substantial redesign process will incur that thus increased cost and processing time. The tree's non-quantifiable relationship with its surrounding is also regarded as something that might be too metaphysical to be contained by planning's dominant knowledge set. These relations are too wishy-washy perhaps for municipal reports, which validity often depends on something that's measurable and lastly also economizable data. Equating trees with housing units is a way to quantify the tree's qualitative attributes. Now, the geographer James C. Scott noted, a central function of statecraft is turning the unknown into something knowable. The state simplifies what it encounters and places them into metrics and grids so that they can be centrally recorded and monitored. Organizing the natural world into grids was in fact one of planning's early motivation and methodology for its disciplinary knowledge creation. Furthermore, the unknown in its raw form is often regarded as illegible or even illegal. Hence, it may impede planning. So, for example, the tree's value or lack of value becomes only legible when presented as housing units. It is not just nature that is quantified. Scott also noted state officials need to actually group citizens into ways that permit them to make collective assessment. And perhaps this is why protesters against densification or the loss of trees are often characterized as failing to grasp planning's notion of civil goodness. Now, is the trade-off to prioritize housing over trees made from an unbiased position? For whom is housing prioritized for? Which perspective is the unbiased perspective? What are the social, cultural, political, and of course economic forces that guide a planner's unbiasedness? What forces form the housing crisis narrative? Could they be the same set of forces that produce a planner's belief that they could practice without biases? Are these the same forces that produce what we can call a biased unbiasedness? In winter cities like Vancouver, sunny sidewalks are definitely important, but also like most cities, Vancouver faces housing unaffordability. And like most cities, it adopts the surplus supply model as the answer. In Vancouver, the tower podium typology, as you can see on the screen, is seen as the answer to ensure sunny sidewalks and housing units. Its form is this: a 4-story podium that will not shade the sidewalks across the street, and a slim tower that goes up to about 20+ stories, but does cast a slim but longer shadow. The other typology common in Vancouver to increase density is the 6 to 8 stories street wall building. Although the street wall building is shorter than a tower podium, it shadows the sidewalks more, at least more than the podium part of the tower podium. You can see the diagram here. However, choosing between the tower podium over the street wall building is not always an easy thing in Vancouver, because the tower podium is often associated with Asian real estate speculation. And until recently, the tower podium stands in contrast to Vancouver's mostly low-rise single-family fabric. The tower form becomes then tied to foreignness in public imagination. Knowing the tower podium's contentiousness, planners have to make a case for it in municipal report and public events. What is interesting is the vocabulary used in some documents to recommend the tower podium over the street wall building. The tower podium is noted to allow more light onto the sidewalks. Now, to allow something suggests what is allowed did not exist or was prohibited before the permission was granted. So, one asks, was sunlight not permitted or non-existent prior to the tower podium's conception? Now, the software used for shadow studies may also influence how light and shadow are understood. In SketchUp, for example, if no buildings are placed into its model space, even if the sun is turned on, there is no visual difference between a lit versus an unlit space. Sunlight is not an existing condition in the model space. It is only when buildings are introduced there that light becomes perceptible, but perceived only with shadows. Light thus becomes shadow's negative space. In this model space, the buildings can be said to produce the light. From the perspective, at least, of this model space, the planner is not wrong in saying the tower podium produces or allows light. Through densification, thus, light is produced, allowed, or even permitted. However, these shadow studies do not question the link between densification and housing. It already assumes that denser, taller buildings with more shadows is a basic requirement. So shadow studies are only tools to reshape and reduce the impact of large shadows. They do not analyze why bigger buildings and bigger shadows are necessary. Trapped in the task of producing the perfect shadow study, the capacity to ask why is curtailed. A shadow study, in fact, is designed to restrict the planner's capacities to probe what forces drive the housing shortage narrative and the surplus supply solution. In not knowing the forces at play, the problem is ill-defined. But it's not ill-defined because of gaps in knowledge. It is ill-defined by design. Shadow studies are not about whether shadows can be tolerated for housing or should be tolerated. It is about what shape of shadows can be tolerated. What forces pit housing against sunlight? Is sunlight only legible when measured by dwelling units? Does each extra meter of shadow really equal to one more family being saved from potential homelessness? Trapped in a shadow study, it is hard to decipher the effects of the study itself. An obvious effect is, of course, colder sidewalks. The less obvious effect is how the tower podium's allowance for sunlight reaffirms the housing crisis narrative and densification push. This increases land prices and makes it harder for non-market housing providers to acquire land for low-income housing. Additionally, with rising land prices, land reparations become more and more difficult. The push to save housing through market solution, actually what happens is it perpetuates age-old sort of ethno-economic territorial segregations. Trapped in a shadow study, the cause and effects of a shadow study are obscure. Now, one effect of a successful shadow study is that these tower podiums get built. But this also means the demolition of possibly existing lower scale buildings. And many of these lower scale buildings could also be low-cost rental apartments where a planner might live. So it is possible that they could be evicted due to the densification plan that the shadow study supports. Now, of course, with job precarity, a planner may have no choice but to do the shadow studies. Yet, you can say, a planner might also find some sense of achievement when their shadow study succeeds in proving that the tower podium is the optimal typology. In doing so, the planner may see themselves as contributing to the civic good. This sense of achievement, along with the belief that the shadow study is unbiasedly designed, might even overcome the anxieties of losing their lodgings. What forces motivate a planner to engage in works that could potentially diminish their own well-being? To explore this question, we might turn to Baruch Spinoza's question, why do people fight for their servitude as if it was their salvation? Here, Spinoza queried the nature of obedience itself. For Spinoza, obedience through violence coercion is often insufficient. Instead, obedience is often motivated by faith, and faith can be a gravitation towards something or someone believed to offer us a better future, even if that future remains rather vague. It could be faith in that divine or a social system. Now, furthermore, being faithful is not just adherence to dogma, but being affected by certain forces that might drive one to willingly perform rituals or processes that are supposed to deliver the future. Ritual becomes life. One develops not just faith for the future, but for the ritual itself. So the planner's ritual of creating compelling shadow diagrams and studies actually reinforces the power and narratives of the planning system that the planner has faith in. And so what forces limit a planner's ability to think and act beyond the shadow study's rituals or even their own faith in the tower podium's deliverance? One might look at the planner's workplace itself to get a hint of these forces. Now, a successful shadow study might win them praises and promotions, which in turn might enable them to buy a unit in a tower podium. Now, these are particular social, psychological, and of course economic forces that may inflect a planner's thinking to its certain persuasion, thus reinforcing the faith that the housing crisis narrative and its proposed solution are unbiased. These forces may also steer the planner towards certain kinds of social events, certain kinds of people, books, and political milieus, and steer them away from others. Encountering less context, the planner's milieu become more and more homogeneous, and this may stun their ability to ask, what else? For Spinoza, passive forces reduce our capacities to think and act critically. They make us passive and diminish our powers to go beyond the given state. It is a form of bondage where we cannot control how we're controlled, or rather, do not know that we are controlled. However, we are not always saddened by passive forces. If so, we will not have the energy or faith to live, to energy to do shadow studies, for example. Beth Lord, a Spinozan scholar, noted, passive forces can produce passive joy. This is a joy that relies on something signaling to you that things you receive, such as promotion and praises, are things to smile about. Indeed, when being promoted, the muscles that bring a smile are genuine and often involuntary. In contrast, there are active forces that actually produce active joy. Active joy is a joy that arises through explorations and creations without being motivated solely by rewards. It is the joy of creating new relationships with others, animate or inanimate things, in order to expand one's mode of living. Now, of course, when you encounter others, both active and passive forces exist. Whether you become more passive or active depends on the kind of existing forces that constitute you. For example, if your body is composed of more active forces, you can be more readily able to repel passive forces. It is also dependent on which aspect of life is affected by which set of forces. For example, in the planner's case, passive forces can overwhelm the planning aspect of their life, and these passive forces may inflect that planner to have faith in that saying, that goes, being happy at your job, you don't work a day in your life. Now, while the paper's title references Arendt's banality of evil, it does not equate planners to Eichmann, nor says planning is fascist. The key differences. For example, Eichmann followed a law designed to exterminate Jews and others in order to build a xenophobic utopia. Planners follow bylaws to build an ideal city for supposed universal citizens. Eichmann wondered why he was not promoted for his effort. Planners wonder if they intend no harm, why are there complaints against their plans to bring civicness? But, I would say this, both believe they acted justly as they acted in accordance with the law. As seen in earlier sections, obedience and faith in the law can spell harm, especially if there is limited knowledge of the law's causes and effects. Not deciphering causes and effects can even badly impact the law follower's well-being. Now, perhaps less of Eichmann and more of planning and planners. One might say intentions speak righteously. They may speak righteously, but intentions have effects. And effects may be asymmetrical to intentions. And here, Arendt's idea of legal crimes may be borrowed to elaborate how acting in accordance with law can sometimes be harmful. She observed Eichmann to be rather normal or even banal, right? A bureaucrat dedicated to his job in implementing the law. She wrote, "One cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann. However, he was not stupid or someone coerced to commit genocide. In fact, he knew well the laws he was implementing. But what he did exhibit was this, a sheer thoughtlessness." Here, Arendt drew out the strange interdependence of thoughtlessness and evil. Not only was Eichmann unable to put himself in another's shoes, he seemed unable to think beyond what his job required him to do. Arendt wrote, "Eichmann carried out his duties without falling back on his conscience." Now, this sentence is useful to articulate the tie between thoughtlessness and evil. Why would one not rely on one's conscience? Perhaps, instead of conscience, they rely on faith. As seen earlier in the paper, Spinoza noted how obedience is often not coerced but willingly done when certain forces make people faithful to certain ideologies, and these people act as if they are one body with these type ideologies. They do not see through the law, but in fact they see as the law. These forces transform one's conscience to be one with the law. And these forces are often also passive forces that can limit a person's capacity to create new relations with others, thus to increase the understanding of cause and effects. It is obvious that the forces Eichmann encountered in the Nazi Bureau did not inflect him in ways that form capacities to see beyond Nazism and its politics of othering. The milieu reaffirms and intensifies the milieu. He could not see how his faith in this milieu, Nazi milieu, could eventually spell his own demise, even as the Third Reich's end was imminent. It was not his capture nor trial that was his demise, but the specific political forces he had faith in that did it. Faith replaces conscience here. So Spinoza's question, why do people fight for their servitude as if it was salvation, can be reframed here as, why did Eichmann fight for his own demise as if it was salvation? Now the planner too fights for their own social, economic, and spatial dislocation, eviction, as if it was salvation. Okay, so Eichmann might be considered a cog by some, but Arendt also maintains that whether he's a cog or not, or whether he's the mastermind, The effects of the actions are unforgivable. Guilt is not attributable to only actions. Cogs are not subjugated beneath the machine. They make up the machine. And one might think of the cog-machine relationship in this way. In practice, the body of law is not divisible into a head who makes up the policies versus the body parts who implement the policies. They're all parts working together to produce the effects. Some parts and bodies and cogs may indeed implement the policies more so, but they also refine their policies through carrying out their duties. This refinement becomes updated policies. Lastly, the faith and even the happiness of each part of cog is needed to upkeep their productivity. They affect each other in ways that produce what Frederick Ladon would call the suitable desires that can sustain the machine's desire. One might suggest then, passive forces produce and sustain other passive forces, thus further reduce the chances to go beyond the milieu. And Arendt also pointed out this. The German state, which is supposed to be the law, has in practice during World War II exhibited a lawlessness. In fact, there are no codified laws that guide how Germans should live with care with non-Germans. Yet many Germans continue to resist Nazi ideologies even when the state commands them to submit to the state. The machine is not inescapable. The legal theorist Massimo Latore, commenting on Arendt's notion of legality, noted that for Arendt, lawfulness is a mode of living that does not diminish the chances for new and even unforeseen relationships with others. It is to build new behaviors of care regardless of whether it is in accordance with law or not in accordance with law. And so if Arendt has a political question, it is how to resist even if one is part of a machine. At this point, we will not speculate whether Eichmann would have acted otherwise. He has done his history. From here, the focus is on the planner's resistance. What could be explored is the idea that social machines are never completely hermetic. For example, the planning machine needs its members to actually innovate a little, to break the mold once in a while in order to sustain the machine's own powers. And to do so, members need to come in contact with systems, with bodies outside the planning machine. These form the rare moments when planners could potentially encounter what Spinoza calls active forces. These are forces, active forces are forces that can in turn increase a body, a mind's capacity to act and think with alterity. It is at these moments when planners may develop new relations of care that are outside of what planning calls the civil. Cogs may connect in new ways to form new machines, albeit these might be new machines are ones that are receptive to active forces that can challenge even faith. So, for the planner who is puzzled at why there continues to be complaints against their plans, even as they try to bring civility to the city, here's a question. Could that faith in the civil, that faith in planning's assumed unbiasedness, be something that produces evil? Can the civil be that exact element that actually shadows a planner's beliefs and intensifies an elusive but harmful imperial project? Evil perhaps is not something or someone always concocting malice or evil by nature. Rather, evil might be seen as the effects of actions that bring harm, such as sustained ethno-economic divides. The banality of the civil might be a prelude to the urbanality of evil. But we hope this paper may be a prelude for another kind of light.